Japanese Reconstruction was incredibly important to the US during the Cold War. Now, during the 1930s, the Great Depression occurred in America. And this is quite important because what the Americans and the British did is they started to close off their empires to foreign investment. And what this did was this kind of made the Japanese economy go bust because they had no market to export to because the Americans couldn't afford the goods, the British couldn't afford the goods, and so on. And this kind of led them to believe that the only way of making sure they were economically self-sufficient was to have an empire. The policy of autarky, which is most famed for use in Nazi Germany during the 1930s. And as we go through the 1930s and into the 1940s and up to 1941, America started imposing more and more sanctions on Japan. And this is one of the problems because as America started imposing more sanctions, Japan starts conquering more. When we get to 1940, the Germans invade France, and the Vichy government gives the Japanese all the rights to the French colonies in East Asia, in particular Vietnam and Indochina, basically all the rights to French Indochina. And therefore, an organisation called the Viet Minh forms, and they start fighting the Japanese. But enough of that. On the December the 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor occurs. The Japanese bomb a load of US ships, brings America into the war, and the Pacific War starts. Over the course of the next 3 years, the US are usually quite successful. The Japanese have about 6 months of success. Then the Battle of Midway occurs, where it's basically a draw, but the Americans destroy 2 more aircraft carriers. Both sides realise that the war can only be won through aircraft carriers. America has a much stronger military, can build more aircraft carriers. The war continues. Then we hit 1945 into the invasion of Okinawa. Okinawa is an extremely important island just off the coast of Japan, and it's brutal. The Japanese refuse to surrender even after 3 months. They fight on even after the Americans have got control of the island. And this is one of the reasons, which is why Roosevelt at Yalta wants Stalin's support for Japan, which is one of the reasons why the Declaration for the Liberation of Eastern Europe is amended by Stalin and then Roosevelt adopts it. It's because Roosevelt needs Stalin's support for Japan. It would have estimated that something like over 30,000 Americans would have been killed had a full-scale invasion of Japan was attempted. Roosevelt wants Stalin to declare war on Japan after the defeat of Germany. And here we go. Then we head to Potsdam. Roosevelt's dead by this point, and so we come into the reign of Harry Truman. Harry Truman, again, kind of wants Russia's, the USSR support in the invasion of Japan. Stalin says he will do that, he will invade, he just needs time to get all his forces from the west to the east. However, in August 1945, the Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs, 1 uranium on the city of Hiroshima and 1 plutonium bomb on the city of Nagasaki, and this basically causes the Japanese surrender. On the 8th of August, just after the second plutonium bomb is dropped, the USSR invade Manchuria and Korea and take a lot of Japanese territory. Now, this is, again, quite important because it means the USSR have a claim in northeast China, which will be used for the Chinese Civil War, but they also have a claim on North Korea, and they're supposed to accept the surrender of the Japanese troops in North Korea. Meanwhile, the Americans deal with the South. But anyway, Stalin requests to be formally acknowledged in the occupation of Japan, and the Americans basically say no. And therefore, it becomes the US's job to try and rejuvenate Japan. This is put under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, who is the supreme commander of the Allied powers. Previously, Japanese society had been heavily on military and warring. This is because they've often felt threatened by other powers. This starts with the Constitution of Japan, which is puts in 3rd of May 1947, which basically says Japan cannot wage war. Emperor Hirohito is still allowed to stay on effectively as a figurehead because it was believed that if the emperor stayed, it would be much safer and less likely to cause revolt. The Constitution created a new 2-house parliament called the Diet. Everyone over the age of 20 could vote in the Diet, includes a Bill of Rights and guaranteed freedom. Japan can only fight, and is still up until today, if they're attacked first. That is one of the main bits of the treaty, and Japan has effectively been a peaceful country since then. Then we had the Tokyo trials, in which many Japanese military members were executed. An example of this is the Bataan Death March, where 70,000 prisoners were forced to walk through the Philippines, of which 10,000 died and 6,000 fled into the jungle, and the commander was executed. However, the problem was they started persecuting communists, as the Americans often do, as opposed to actual Japanese criminals, because they wanted Japan to be a strong thing. Land reform programs were started. Japan gave Manchuria back to China, and the Japanese people were happy with these economic changes. The Dodge Plan under a man called Joseph Morrell Dodge. That comes in, and that's to help rejuvenate Japanese economy. The Reconstruction of Japan kind of tied Japan to the US, and in particular, Japan had used to do a lot of trading on the Asian markets, but since the communist takeover of China, the Americans basically forbid it, and therefore they had to basically trade with America as the only thing. Then we hit 1951, which was called the San Francisco Peace Treaty, which is basically the final peace between Japan and the US. The treaty was remarkably lenient. It's almost as lenient as a treaty between Russia and Finland in 1944. It's very lenient. The treaty does not place significant restrictions on Japan's economy or on future political model. It doesn't identify Japan's responsibility for war, doesn't restrict its rearmament. The US refused to sign the treaty. However, they'd already boycotted due to Mao Zedong's government not being in the UN, so it kind of just got passed through anyway. The treaty basically recognised the sovereignty of the Japanese people, which is always good. Japan had to basically give back all the territories: Korea, Taiwan, Kuril Islands, Parcel Islands, Baratal Islands. That sounds right. The US were required Japan to sign a bilateral treaty. This is about giving the US use of military bases in Japan, Okinawa, the right to use military force to intervene in internal disorder and that kind of thing. Then we hit 1951, we're in the middle of the Korean War, and therefore MacArthur decides to set up the National Police Reserve, which is a defensive league. The Japanese government make 110,000 ground troops and 7,600 maritime personnel. This is known as the National Safety Agency. And this is about basically giving Japan a kind of semi-army in case communism invades. But the main things they tried to do was just simply, if the Japanese economy works so well, then there will be no need for communism to thrive, and therefore the people of Japan will be happy, and also the US will be happy. In one of the main things in the Korean War is that UN bought 500 million of military equipment per year from Japan. They gave 300 million a year to fix military equipment. That's 800 million coming in exclusively from the UN. This is one of the reasons why the Japanese economy was boosted so significantly. After 1954, there starts to become a wider trend on defending Asia, and Japan is part of the defensive perimeter strategy, which is introduced by Dean Akinson in 1949. And Japan, more or less even to this day, the Americans still have a presence on Okinawa, and Japan has, since 1945, become one of the greatest economies in the world. Thank you very much for listening.